Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another edition of TBR. I'm George Binns, and we're starting the local campaign season a little early this year, and we have as our guest the candidate for the mayor, Brendan Sweeney, who is better known as the City Councilor at Large.
Thanks,
Welcome,
George.
Brendan.
Thank you. It's always great to be in the studio here with you.
So I guess one of the questions that's come up as soon as the word got out you were running is get down to the nitty-gritty of what's the mayor's role relative to setting the tax rate compared to what the city council does.
Yeah, so that's an interesting one that kind of highlights how our city government is structured. So to take a step back and first think about what the role of the mayor is more generally. So the mayor is the city's chief executive officer.
Yeah.
The mayor is the elected head of the executive branch. And when you think about it, the mayor is elected to run an organization with an operating budget of nearly $200 million.
Yeah.
So those type of managerial skill sets, how to run an organization, how to manage finances of an organization, especially one as complex as the city. Those are things that I have a lot of experience with in my day job working as the assistant town administrator and finance director for the town of Boxford, where I do a lot of the same things that the mayor does here, but just at the town level in an appointed position. And I also have a lengthy resume of government finance experience from my time working in state government in the Office of Administration and Finance there. And I know we'll dive into that a little further as we continue along the show. But to think about the tax rate, that's actually set by the city council, but the mayor is the one who presents the proposed, well, the Board of Assessors do, working for the mayor. They're the ones that bring forward the tax rate proposal itself. But really where the change is implemented that affects the tax rate is when the actual budget itself is finalized. And as you know, the city council, as the legislative branch, reviews and approves the budget every June, but it's the mayor that brings forth the budget.
Yeah.
So as a councilor, I proposed amendments. This past year, I was concerned that and I still am concerned that we are spending at a rate that's not going to be sustainable a few fiscal years down the road. And so I had proposed some cuts that the majority of my colleagues did not agree with. There were some small tweaks made. But as the mayor, I'll really, if I'm fortunate enough to be elected, really be able to dive into the details of how our city government's running, what we're doing well, what we may not be doing well, where some redundancies may be that we could eliminate and hopefully find some cost savings, maybe streamline some services. So being able to be in that position to bring forth a budget to the city council that ensures that we're providing the core services, of course, that's what city government is there to do, but doing so in a cost-efficient manner. That's something that really is one of the few reasons that I was motivated to run for mayor, is to have the opportunity to make those changes from the inside much earlier on in the process than I'm able to as a councilor, just voting at the end.
So basically, I guess what you're telling me, it comes down to the mayor, through his executive function, gets all the estimates from all the departments, rolls it all together, makes a budget out of it. Actually, Brian Ayers does the rolling. And then the assessors come in and say, this is how much the value of the property is and how much we can assess taxes, and divide one by the other, and lo and behold, you come out with a tax rate. So essentially, I guess it is the mayor presents the tax proposal that will pay for the budget.
Yeah, and the biggest thing that is worth keeping in mind is that as a local level and at the state too, we are required to balance our budget.
Yeah.
And our revenues are capped through Proposition 2.5, where the entirety of the tax levy, which is everything that all the taxes raised in Beverly, can only go up 2.5% every year, with the only exception that any new development tax revenue that comes from that new development can be added on top of it, which is called new growth. But that's why it's so critically important for the mayor to make sure that that he or she is setting a very intentional effort to not only bring forward a balanced budget for the current fiscal year, the fiscal year to come when the budget's being proposed, but that the mayor is ensuring that city operations are structured in a way that the city is set for long-term financial stability, and that we're not spending at a rate where we know that this Proposition 2.5 revenue ceiling limits our revenues, and if we're spending at a higher percentage increase than our revenues are going up, eventually we're going to get to that point where we hit our revenue ceiling. And so that's a little bit of my concern, where I think there are ways to make city government a little more efficient than it is now, and I would like to, if given the opportunity by the voters of Beverly, really dive into that work so that we don't have to make massive cuts in the event that our revenues are below where our spending is projected to be.
Well, we can project, I guess, fairly well where the revenues are going. One of the guesstimates that's involved in it is what's going to change the assessment, and that's one of my oh yeah, right kind of comments that, the mayor's been bragging about, well, we've been well under the 2.5% limit the last couple of years, and I go through the tax bills that I've been paying, and I'm paying an increase of about 4.2% a year, and that's really because the assessments keep going up.
And that's a very good point to bring up, George. So at a high level, we are able to shift a greater percentage of the tax burden on commercial and industrial properties if we so choose as a city. And that's what we've done. The state limits the amount that you can shift that burden because you don't want to just unfairly...
you don't want to drive all the businesses out of town.
Exactly. It's a balancing act. As a city, we've maxed how far we can shift that burden onto commercial properties. And so what that means is that, especially at a time where commercial properties are more or less staying level in value, or they had been decreasing coming out of the pandemic, and residential values are skyrocketing. They've leveled off a little bit, but they're still high. That's led to the actual assessments for residential values going up and up and up, and that residential piece taking up a much larger portion of the pie. And that's something, as a city councilor, that I was very cognizant of in talking to, especially to seniors and veterans, folks who may be on fixed incomes, where there were some tax exemptions available to help deal with these large increasing property tax bills every year. But we actually had the ability as a city to increase the amount of the exemptions available for seniors and veterans. And so that's something that I had learned about from my work with the state and with the town of Boxford. And what I did is brought forth a proposal to make sure that we were offering the maximum amount of exemptions available for qualifying seniors and veterans so that we can help the folks who need it most try to afford to stay in their homes. And so that's really an initiative
that's happened, and how's that working out?
So this is the first fiscal year that it was implemented. I proposed it in April. The city council approved it. It is worth noting, so this April 1st is the deadline. And for anybody watching, if you think you may qualify, please reach out to the city assessor's office. We will know probably start of the new fiscal year what the current FY25 exemption numbers ended up being. But it's a good program to try to address what you mentioned, where residential property tax bills are just going up so significantly.
That gets to be a real problem with the city, that, again, with the seniors, that you get into one of these large houses that you needed to grow a family in, and next thing you know, they've grown up and they've got homes of their own, either in town or someplace else, and you're stuck with a very large house with a very large tax bill, neither of what you need. So any help you can get, and I guess the ADUs might be a part of the contributor to how do you offset this burden.
And that's the hope. So you've kind of mentioned some of the housing factors at play here in the larger situation that we're in Beverly. And I hope the ADUs are an avenue to maybe bring some more affordable but not so large in scale housing into the city. But that's one thing that I want to focus on, is I want to look at how we are zoned in the various, zoning districts across the city, and see whether there's a way for us to, from the city government's point of view, create an environment that's favorable for development of more reasonably priced small multifamily housing, 2 or 3 family units. Because I think that's really the missing piece in the city's larger housing picture. We've seen pretty significant development on Rantoul Street, some of which is larger than I would like and a little closer to the road than I would like, which I'm hoping we address with design standards that the mayor should be bringing before the city council at some point soon. But setting those larger buildings aside, which I don't think that model is what Beverly wants to see outside of the Rantoul Street corridor, and I agree with that. So that means we need to look to a way to still bring some level of density, and that's where I think the 2 to 3 family, smaller multifamily units are a really good opportunity if there is a place in the city that makes sense to build that housing without changing the character of any existing neighborhood. And the hope is that that gives an opportunity for someone who grew up in the city, raised their kids in the city, their kids have moved out, they want to stay in Beverly, but they don't want to move to a large apartment building on Rantoul Street. If some of these missing middle housing units exist, I think that would help. Won't solve the housing issues that we have in the city, but I think it could go a long way toward helping address them.
Well, here we are at the Beverly High School. This is where the studio is. And I was looking out over the field, the athletic field outside, and along the street is 6 or 7 duplexes, side-by-side houses. And they've been here since, I don't know, before the high school. So it's not something that is foreign to the city.
No.
It's around in different places. And the other neat thing about getting into a multifamily house, you buy in, you live on the first floor, you rent out the second floor, the third floor, and that's a fundamental road to get to developing some equity because you've got somebody else helping you pay the mortgage. So it's not an onerous idea as some people portray it.
And the biggest thing is city government, we need to be proactive in ensuring that our zoning ordinance fosters the type of strategic growth that we would like to see. And that's one concern that I've had with how the current administration has approached some parameters of the larger zoning ordinance. I mentioned the design standards. That's a document that I'm hoping we'll see in this spring, ideally, that would require setback from the road and open space requirements for some of these larger buildings on Rantoul Street. Had we had the foresight to bring that forward before some of the development that we saw over the last 10 years took place, maybe we wouldn't have as much of an issue of the tunnel aspect on Rantoul Street that folks cite as an issue and an understandable one with how that area has grown. So just these things don't happen by themselves. You need to really be intentional in utilizing some of the tools of city government. You don't want to be heavy-handed, obviously, and the market does drive, really, at the end of the day, how development will look. But there are real opportunities we have to set the standards that we as a city would like to see for future development, for historic preservation of existing buildings. That's something that I really want to dive into and see if there's a way to outline in a more formal manner the requirements for the facade of buildings in historic districts or otherwise. So I think there's an opportunity there.
Well, that gets to be one of the fundamental questions of what's the character of Beverly? And I think everybody's got a different opinion of it. And one of the comments that I heard from a previous city councilor, the character is change. It's always changing. It's an old city that's been around for quite some time, and the world around us has changed, and the city has changed to adapt to it. So part of the game, I guess, is getting comfortable with the changes. And how do you convince people that this ain't so bad?
Well, that being said, so I think there are certainly benefits that we've seen to revitalizing areas that were otherwise not the nicest parts of town. certainly from a financial standpoint, that new growth is a real asset to helping us pay for some of these essential city services. But what's really important is that we preserve the things that do make Beverly truly unique. We are a historic city.
Yeah.
And there's a lot to, from the coastline and Independence Park and some of the history there that I know we're trying to be take a more intentional effort to share that history with the community to other parts of the city. It's important that we take effort, and Historic Beverly does a good job, but that we make efforts to tell the story of Beverly's history and that we preserve the beauty of the coastline that really make us a historic seaside New England community. So with that in mind, certainly there's going to be changes, but as long as we're looking to preserve some of those core aspects of what makes Beverly unique.
Well, one of the opportunities is going to be revitalizing the Bass River overlay. That thing's been kicking around for a number of years. That keeps coming up and it gets sidelined. And
though I will say it's understandably sidelined given the issue we're facing with the Hall-Whitaker Bridge.
Yeah,
I don't think we can do anything there until that bridge is fixed.
A new wrinkle that we've got to smooth out before we can go much farther. And that gets into one of the other big issues in town of there are a lot of things in town that the city really doesn't control, like the bridges, like the access to 128. And there are opportunities, yes, to develop Folly Hill a little better. But if you develop Folly Hill and you exit Folly Hill onto 128, you can only go to Gloucester.
Yeah, that's a very problematic
and that's a situation.
Transportation situation with the potential development there.
Yeah, and at the same time, turning around and going back through the city from Folly Hill, that's going to jam up a bunch of roads. So there are issues involved in that they're not solely in the camp of Beverly to solve. The same thing with trying to revitalize Dunham Road. I mean, Cummings is, I think, doing a very good job of improving the developments there. But the more they develop, the more traffic goes through a neighborhood that shouldn't have to go through a neighborhood. So, again, it's an issue of what do we want to do and how do we get the state to agree that, yeah, that's the right way to do it, and pony up some supporting money.
And that's a really important point you made there. The mayor of Beverly needs to have strong relationships with state officials and a good understanding of how to get things done at the state level. And I have both, which I believe I can bring as a benefit to the mayor's office. I had mentioned I worked in state government for 4 years in the Office of Administration and Finance when Charlie Baker was the governor. And so I got to see from really what I consider to be the state's central nervous system, how all of these various agencies operate, what their streams of funding are, what their priorities are in terms of various policy areas. So if I were to be elected mayor, I would know exactly which agency we would need to go to for some of these specific projects that you mentioned. But then it's also about relationships. And this is something that I've been able to develop through my work with the Massachusetts Municipal Association, which is a statewide organization of cities and towns that advocates for the needs of cities and towns on Beacon Hill. And I'm a member of the board of directors there. Through my work with the Massachusetts Municipal Association, I sit on Lieutenant Governor Kim Driscoll's Local Government Advisory Commission, so I have a direct voice in shaping how the administration, or at least providing feedback to the administration for how they look to work with cities and towns. So I plan to build off of that foundation and really hit the ground running, advocating for Beverly's needs with specific projects like the Hall-Whitaker Bridge, the Dunham Road intersection, and what we're going to do there. You mentioned the transportation issues at Folly Hill and the development that, to me, really the scale of what's being proposed does not at all fit the current transportation system, and I hope that state officials realize that. But I plan to leverage these relationships for Beverly's benefit if I'm elected mayor.
The other thing that concerns me about it is cell signaling took over the motel years ago, and they've developed a pretty good complex there. And they expanded into Manchester. I start to wonder would there have been something that the city of Beverly could do to make sure that business stays here? Because we can always use another business in town or an expanded one. The Plan Beverly that got published several years back mentioned something like 90% of the people who work in Beverly work in some form of the healthcare industry. Cell signaling is a prime example of that. And its predecessor, New England Biolabs. So encouraging those kinds of businesses to expand here, I think, is something that ought to be on the mayor's table.
I agree.
Worry about.
And I think it's important that we look at the larger businesses in Beverly, but also the smaller businesses. And this, I've been able to build a good relationship with Beverly's small business community. I sit on the Economic and Community Development Council. I'm active with the Greater Beverly Chamber of Commerce and their Government Affairs Committee, working with those small business owners. So it's important that we look holistically at economic development and the state of our small business community and what there is for ways that the city can partner with those businesses. So for me, I think what's really important is to start by listening to these business owners and making sure that the city truly understands their needs. That's something that we've been trying to do more of on the Economic and Community Development Council, and that intentionality towards forming that partnership in an effective manner is something that I'll bring to the mayor's office.
Yeah. So there's a lot of coordination involved. And I think part of the exercise is going to be, you can't do it all by yourself. So we get into the question of what kind of a staff do you need, and how do you develop that kind of a staff that is involved in these kinds of issues and got similar experience to what you're bringing to it.
Yeah.
They know what the city can do. They know what the state can do. And they have some clue as to how to merge the two.
So what's really important when I think about how to get the most out of the staff in City Hall is making sure that we are bringing in good people to serve as our various department heads. I think it's really important that the mayor obviously needs to be on top of all major projects, but the mayor can't micromanage.
Yes.
There needs to be a reliance to some extent on the expertise of the folks that we put in those positions to make recommendations that are in their professional judgment for the best interest of Beverly. And then it's up to the mayor to, with the understanding of the community, figure out what to do.
That's part of your job as mayor, to make sure that these are people who are really qualified for the tasks they have.
Exactly.
And surprise, surprise, we've had almost a half hour of fun. So the last 5 minutes are yours to make your pitch to the audience on why they should vote for you.
Well, thank you, George. And thank you to everybody who tuned in to watch this segment, which I hope will be the first of many that across both here in the BevCamp studio and out in the community, we discuss why this election is so important and what the future of our city is going to look like, not only for this coming 4-year mayoral term, but for the decade or so beyond. I really do believe that these next 4 years and what we as a city do to set ourselves up for the long-term future will have an impact for the next 10 plus. And so what I want to bring to the mayor's office is my experience in running cities and towns. And that, to me, is what I believe separates me from the other candidates or potential candidates. So really what it boils down to is there are 3 reasons why I'm running for mayor. The first is I believe after 12 years, the city would benefit from a change in perspective in the executive office. And I think I can bring not only a fresh perspective, but one that's experienced and understands the challenges of running a city and town, which brings me to my second point. I have experience doing this. In my current job, working for the town of Boxford, I manage the town's $40 million budget. I build the capital plan. I negotiate with unions, and I will be at the table negotiating with unions in Beverly if I am fortunate enough to be elected mayor. And I managed a $500 million federal COVID relief grant program when I was working in the state that helped provide aid to cities and towns in need. So I've walked the walk, so to speak, when it comes to running a city, and I believe that I can step in day one without a learning curve if I'm fortunate enough to be elected mayor And that brings me to my third point. There are specific things that I believe I can change for the better for this city if I'm to be elected. I think it's really important that we improve communication with residents and that we step our game up when it comes to constituent services so that if folks reach out to City Hall with a need, they're able to get a response to whatever their issue might be. I think it's important that we are much more intentional about planning for the future, especially capital planning, when it comes to some of the big projects in the city so that we can effectively utilize your taxpayer dollars to tackle our big infrastructure needs, to improve our road and sidewalk network, and to make sure that the city services are being run as efficiently as possible. So for those three reasons, I believe that I am the best candidate to be the next mayor of Beverly. I humbly ask that you would consider voting for me in September. The preliminary election will be September 23rd, and then hopefully, if I'm fortunate enough to advance on to the general election on November 4th, that you would consider voting for me to be the next mayor of Beverly. But if you'd like to learn more, please visit our website, which is sweeneyforbeverly.com, and you can also visit our Facebook page, which is facebook.com/sweeneyforbeverly. So I'm very excited to get to talk further with you about why I'm running, what I could bring to this campaign, and to hear more about the issues that matter most to you. Thanks, George.
You're welcome. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us this evening. And as usual, my email address is at the head of the credits and at the tail end of the credits. So if you've got a question that I should have asked or some comments, feel free to send me an email with them, and we'll try to include them in one of our future discussions. As well as if you got another point that's a little deeper than what we're dealing with here, there's always room for you here at the table. Thanks again for joining us, and stay tuned. There'll be more.